So as we go into 1917, there is news out of Russia. (1917), the Russians go into revolution, the famous Russian revolutions, plural. There are two of them in 1917. These occur in March. So these are the Russian February revolutions. In case you find that strange, I did mention that Russia is very, very far behind the rest of Europe. In fact, they're using a different calendar that throws them off by about 2 weeks. So on our calendar, it occurred in March. In their calendar, it occurred in February. Their February revolution. They took down the Tsar. They've had enough. The destruction of 1914, 1915, 1916. The Russian people rise up against the government, against the Tsar, take down the Tsar's government, and put up a provisional government. This is a temporary government as they try to figure out what kind of government they want in their revolution. And what the provisional government does, this temporary government does, is it announces to the Russians that they're going to stay in the war. There's the problems with the Tsar. The Tsar wasn't running the war correctly, and so the Russians, this government believes they owe it to the Allies, France and Britain, to stay in the war. They won't function much after this, but they do agree to stay in the war. By March, so within a couple of weeks, Vladimir Lenin, a communist, he had been exiled from Russia, and he returns to Russia. The Germans actually will provide his way to get to Russia. As Russia's in a revolution, the Germans will send Lenin over there. Lenin will come in as the Bolshevik, the leader of the Bolshevik party, the Communist Party. And these Bolsheviks now have an idea, a motto, a platform. Here's their platform: peace, land, and bread. It's an easy platform to remember, and they will get it done, and the people will support them. They want peace, to stop the war. They want land, that the Russian people should own their own farm or have a piece of land or a house. And they want bread. There are people starving in Russia, in a country that's full of food. Why are people starving? And they become very successful. And by November, on our calendar, October on their calendar, the Bolsheviks knock down the provisional government and take over Russia. Russia is the first country to fall out of World War I because, as the Bolsheviks promised, they will announce that they are done with the war. So Russia is the first country to collapse and the first country to drop out of the war. This is the communist taking over Russia. Lenin will create his new country, a union of Soviet Socialist Republics, the USSR. Lenin's new, not Russia anymore, not an empire anymore, but a USSR, a union of Soviet Socialist Republics. So in March of 1918, he does as he promised. He will take Russia out of the war. He signs a treaty with the Germans. It's called the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. You don't have to know the name of this treaty for the Western Civ I, Western Civ II this is. But I do want you to know what he did. He surrendered a ton of land to the Germans. He basically just gave the Germans anything they wanted. Take it all. Take from Finland to Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, all the way down to Poland and beyond. He just gave it over to the Germans. And the question might come up of why? Why would you just do this? Why would you just end the war and then give it all to the Germans? The Germans weren't doing terribly well on the Western Front. And the reason for this is, number one, not everyone becomes a communist overnight. Russia falls into a civil war. This Union of Soviet Socialist Republics takes a little while to build. There's a civil war going on. Lenin and his Reds, or the communists, against anybody else, pretty much should be called the whites. If you're not a red, you're a white. And then some of them want the Tsar back, some of them don't, and so it's a very confusing thing for the whites. The Reds are a little bit more united than the whites, and as you know, the Reds will win this civil war, but it takes a while. The second reason is that the communist belief is that Russia is the first country to turn to communism, and everyone will pretty soon do that, including Germany and Britain and France. And so there's no reason to fight the Germans. We'll just give them what they want because they'll soon turn to communism anyway. The communist belief was that communism will be worldwide. So here's what you see him surrender from Finland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, all the way down through Poland and the Ukraine. Just give that all over to the Germans. For the Germans, it's a great moment. They have won the Eastern Front. The Eastern Front is over. It's a German victory. So in 1917, with their huge success in the East, with the collapse of Russia, it's a great time for Germany in the East. But in the West, you've got a moment of desperation. They are really at the end of their rope. The Verdun thing worked initially, but then the Somme has become a disaster for them, and so the Germans are in real desperation. So for 1918, for the Germans, they come up with a new thought for 1918. They're going to bring new commanders in for 1918. The guys from the east. This is Hindenburg and Ludendorff, the guys I introduced you to in 1914. They're brought now from the east over to the west. Hindenburg and Ludendorff. And here's what they've decided. That the west, trench warfare, that was killing the Germans. What they need in the west now is what they were doing in the east. Not dig trenches. And instead, the new tactic is to infiltrate. To not just charge the French, but to actually sneak through their trenches, sneak across no man's land into the trenches. The men to do this have got to be specially trained troops, veterans, not young 15, 16-year-old boys, but veteran men, men who won't crack under pressure, men who can sneak at night. And they will be given great weapons, the best weapons possible, new weapons, best weapons, hand grenades, flamethrowers, handheld machine guns, and infiltrate through the French or the British trenches at night, and then the big, huge attack will come in the morning. These infiltrations will sneak in and cut the French communications, the telephone lines and whatnot, and then the big attack will come in the morning. So they're ready for 1918. For this, all resources now will come to the Western Front. The Eastern Front has been a victory. The Germans will send everything to the Western Front. And they also decide that before this, they got to make sure that the French are at the end of their rope. And so they will try to block any sort of war material getting to France. Well, how do you do that? How do you stop material from getting to France? Well, they send out the submarines again. Remember, in 1915, they stopped with the submarines because America almost went to war. But now in 1918, it's got to be everything out. 1917, 1918. Got to throw everything out, bring back out the submarines to stop anything from getting to France. Well, this has a huge effect on us. In 1916, they knew what we were doing. In 1916, we had gone through an election year. Woodrow Wilson ran for his second term, and here was his campaign strategy. He kept us out of war. The Germans saw this, that he's a peace candidate. Wilson won't go to war. Not to mention our army was tiny. America, 50 states, or 48 at the time, a tiny, tiny army. And then our army wasn't really an army. It was just a bunch of regiments, just a loose collection of men, 1,000 at a time, without much training. Our guys were just basically holding down forts, either around the world or somewhere, who knows where. But the Germans were not impressed by this. And so they send out their submarines, and as expected, we go to war. They expected us to declare war. Maybe not as fast as we did, but they expected it, and they figured that there's nothing really to fear from us. So the Germans resume their submarine warfare again, and as expected, we break diplomatic relations with them. And then that was pretty much enough to go to war. But on March 1st, they did the terrible thing of releasing this Zimmermann telegram, or we intercepted, or the British intercepted this Zimmermann telegram. It was from the German ambassador to Mexico, telling the Mexicans to go to war with us, and the Germans would help them get back Texas and Arizona, New Mexico, California. Just unbelievable stuff. And when that hit the press, if you didn't really care about submarines, now you care. And it's not long before we go to war. April 5th, we declare war on the Germans. So the submarine started it off, but the Zimmermann telegram definitely finished it. Wilson moved faster than anybody could possibly expect. He'd been actually preparing for this. He ran on the campaign platform in 1916 of he kept us out of war while he was preparing for war. He knew we were going to war. The general he selects for us is a guy named Blackjack Pershing. He will be leading the American army over into France, commander of the AEF, the American Expeditionary Force of American troops. The white troops will be called doughboys because of their pasty white skin as opposed to the French who are all bloodied. So we come over smiling as the doughboys, landing in France on the west coast of France and then marching all the way across through Paris with claims of Lafayette. We are here. This were us returning the favors. Americans were returning the favor to the French. The French helped us in our American Revolution. So here we are marching across France, the white troops anyway, the doughboys, across France, and the effect is huge. The French were at the point of break here in 1917 as these French troops now are going to be restored. Their morale will be restored as Americans are here. We don't know how to fight, but we're here, and we're planning on helping the French. So Pershing, you got to give him a little bit of credit here. Turns out to be a really good commander for us. He will keep the American troops separate. The French wanted troops to just feed into the lines to retake Verdun, and Pershing knew not to do that, so he keeps the American troops separate. He also knew that American troops were not well trained. We're going to need a lot of training. All we knew how to do was shoot a rifle. We're going to need equipment, better equipment than we're using, just more than rifles. We need machine guns. We need airplanes. We need maybe even tanks. So we're going to keep separate. We have to get all kinds of new equipment. Initially, as we come into France in 1917, we will be only for defense. But this is enough. The fact that American troops are there to help and defend allows the French troops to have better morale and actually shift the French troops over toward Paris. Just to bring up the American troops, I mentioned white troops. In World War I, American Army is completely segregated. The white troops will be under Pershing's command. The black troops, and there were several black regiments, will be sent and just basically handed over to the French. And they will fight bravely. They'll be decorated by the French, and when the war is over, many of them will want to stay in France because they were treated equally in France. So here's the Western Front now. American troops have marched from the western side of France through Paris, and then will take place in the French lines around Lorraine right here, which allows these French troops to shift over and guard Paris more closely. So here's your Allied command structure here. The French will have overall command, since the war is being fought mostly in France. And your commander is a guy named Foch. This is him, Commander Foch. And then here's his three subordinate commanders. On the French side, Marshal Pétain, or General Pétain, the guy hero of Verdun, and the General Haig for the British, and then Pershing. And of course, Pershing is told that he doesn't have to follow orders. Wilson tells him you can do whatever you want. So the French aren't really happy, but they'll take what they can get. Because the French are really suffering here. In 1917, as we arrived, was really good news at perfect time, because the French were about to crack. The French army was in a state of mutiny all through the French lines. The French soldiers were not going to attack anymore. They just told their commanders, I won't attack. And so they are picked by lot. Every 100 men will have to draw lots, and there's many are taken out and shot. This is not good for the French army. That shows their morale's about to crack. They kept this secret from the Germans, but really perfect timing. We arrived just in time as the French were about to crack. So here's your Western Front again as we pull into 1918. Again, the Germans still aiming for Paris. The American troops are here now. The French troops are here, and then the British troops up by Belgium. So at the end of 1917, here's your news. Here's your situation. The Bolsheviks have taken over Russia, and the Russians now are out of the war. The same for the Italians. The Italians launched one last offensive in 1917 called the Caporetto Offensive, and it was a wipeout. This is what Hemingway's book, A Farewell to Arms, is about, that this terrible offensive, very ineffective, just catastrophe all around for the Italians. And then these French mutinies are going on in 1917. Their army has just come to a grinding halt. They will defend. Those French soldiers will say they will defend France. They just don't want to attack the Germans anymore. Just as the American troops are arriving, that's your situation at the end of 1917.